So we're going to be talking about my assumptions and how I made my APV for the ending year of 2014, 558 2000.10. Throughout the simulation, you're presented with over 27 different options, and so it's looking at those options and figuring out, what do you need to do and how do I estimate that and going from there. A lot of it was looking at those capital budgeting tools, and a lot of it was looking at the income statements and balance sheets and going from there. Obviously, the higher the numbers on those, if you're on the green, that's going to be better than if you're negative. So that definitely played into part of it. Looking at resource allocation, obviously, is the main thing. We're going to start with while we're still on the screen. You want your company to be diversified. I obviously didn't do a good job of that, which is obvious when you look at my revenue by division. My production revenue has 222.229.02, which is going to be the largest sector, and then followed by retail, which is 235.82, and then licensing is 29.81. So obviously the allocation towards the end was looking at how can I diversify my company more and how can I figure out what's going on. Part of that also allocation was looking at the updates and looking at how each thing is doing. Obviously, if something wasn't doing well, then I didn't want to do it. And, if I didn't want to do it, then I moved down and looked at something else. The cost also came into this, obviously. So looking at the companies and stuff like that, when we look at the replacement of products and stuff like that, I didn't pick any of that because looking at those capital budgeting tools, I didn't feel safe with it because it didn't look that appealing. So your NPV is going to be 0.06, your IRR is 38%, your payback is 3 years, and your PI is 0.87. So obviously it's not one. So that means it's going to be a project that you're going to decline, but I actually picked some products that had a low PI. So we're going to kind of look at, besides those, looking at these numbers. So the main thing with products like this is you're going to go steady, you're going to have an increase, and you're going to decrease, and you're going to be zero the whole time. So yes, you're breaking even, and you have some assets, but you're going to lose those assets eventually. So that's kind of how I did looking at those and kind of looking at, what's going on with that. When we get to expansions, I actually did a couple of those expansions just based off of how the clothing line was doing itself. So I did the Match My Doll clothing line expansion, but I started with the clothing line itself and looked at how that was doing and if that was worth going into it. So we looked at, again, started with NPV, the IRR, the payback period. Again, this is going to be super high, but that PI is 2.275. So that means we're going to be getting that return greater than what we thought. So that's going to be something to look forward to. But again, you can't just base these off of these. So we're going to look into the numbers. When we look into the numbers, net income is going to be positive right off the get-go, which is always good. Your total assets are going to increase, which means your company is more valued. And then your ending cash balance after you do investing and stuff like that is still going to be positive. It's not a super great high ending cash balance, but your net income is not too shabby, which makes this project acceptable. Investment mutually exclusive products, obviously you can only pick one. You can only pick one and hope for the best. So the one that I ended up doing was the acquisition of the electronic toy manufacturer. Again, looking at those capital budgeting with the net present value being 16.34, the IRR of 12%. There were a couple that were higher, but looking at the payback period, that's also super high. And that PI is still not one, so that, there's multiple red flags saying you shouldn't do this. However, again, looking at the balance sheet and the income statement, your net income right off the bat is going to be one of the largest out of these products. So starting from 2.95 going up to 16.37 is super impressive. Again, your assets are going to increase. They're going to kind of decrease, but that's okay because you're still staying positive throughout the rest of the operations. So it's looking at both of those projects and looking at what can I afford with my budget restraint and what can I do with that money and what's going to be the best on me. So the growth of the company, again, was driven by these and looking at how I can do or what I can do. So some of this was done in licensing, which we talked about earlier. I needed to do more of, but that's kind of the growth of the company is what can I do to get it better. So what are NPV and the IRR and the payback period and the PI? We talked about that earlier. NPV is going to be the net present value. So how much money are you putting into it? How much money is that money going to be worth? Your IRR is your internal rate on return. So how much you're going to get back after you invest and get all that stuff back. And then your payback period is how long is it going to take to get that money back. And the PI is that profitability index, which is going to show you if it's really acceptable to invest Obviously, the higher the better on all of these, except that payback period. Your PI, we're looking at something that we want, or at 1, which is going to say it's an okay one, but obviously a PI of greater than 1 is going to be the best. But again, you cannot just consider these because you have to look into the company at the balance sheet and stuff like that. So the starting point for this simulation was looking at those capital budgeting simulations and figuring out where those were. That kind of ranked my projects and what I wanted to do, and kind of going from there. The risk I actually didn't manipulate just because, it's better safe than sorry. How higher the risk, the higher the rewards, but that also means if you fail, that could be less money that you're not going to get. So being a first-time person running this simulation and not knowing what I wanted to do or what I was looking for, I kind of kept the risk low. Had I done a higher risk, all these numbers could have increased. They all could have done a lot better, but again, you're staying with what's safe and what's right. So the rules of capital budgeting, they do pertain to this, and they do give you warning signs of what to look for and what not to look for. But, just like everything, looks can be deceiving. Take, for example, this acquisition of the electronic toy manufacturer. The general principle with the PI of 1 or higher, you're going to try to stay away with because you want something that's going to be higher than 1. But when you start looking at the net income, when you start looking at the operating costs, these are pretty impressive numbers. I'm going to start with 2.95 million, but I'm going to end with 16.37 over the course of 5 or 6 years. So that's kind of super impressive. And your money's always gonna, more of your money, going back to the dashboard, your money's always going to be in production and in retail. That's where all your money's going to be. Yes, they're higher risk, meaning that if something goes wrong, it's going to infect you. If something doesn't go right, it's going to hurt you. But if something goes really super well, your product's selling super well, your stuff is going to increase. Licensing's kind of a safe bet. You make something, you sell the license. So video games and stuff like that are going to be a safe bet, but they're not going to have as high reward on your return as something else. So if we go back and we look at the doll video game, your NPV is 1. It's not horrible, it's not great. Your IRR is 115%, which looks super appealing. Payback period is 2 years, so not too long, and your PI is 8.73. However, when you start looking at everything else right off the bat, you're going to be negative in income. And then you're going to go positive, and then again you're going to go negative, or you're going to go break even. The reason this wasn't appealing a project is because video games have fads. Once you make it into on the market, your sales are going to decrease. So yes, that could increase my licensing, but I also have to look at the profitability of my company and figure out what is the best for me. And again, looking at these product updates really helped understand. So kind of in summary, definitely looking at your capital budgeting tools, your NPV, your IRR, your PI, and your break-even, or not your break-even point, your payback period are going to be starting tools. They can definitely help you understand of what's acceptable right off the bat without having to go into every project, but they're not going to be the end-all be-all of your company. These are just ratios that are set to describe you, and it's all based off of your operating cost and your rate of return, or your investment and your cash flows. It doesn't take into account the market standards. It doesn't take into account for everything that your business and stuff is going to come up with or endure. So when looking at that, I highly suggest that you don't just look at those numbers and take those as truth, that you look into your balance statement and your income sheets and see what's going to happen.